ciudades en Marte y en Venus, Mercurio se convirtió en un vergel.
Nous vivions 3 fois plus longtemps. C'était une ère miraculeuse.
Wir blickten in die Galaxis und wussten, es war uns beschieden, im Licht anderer Sterne zu wandeln. Doch der Reisende hatte einen Feind.
A treva, que o caçara por milhares de anos atravessando os golfos negros do espaço.
黄金時代が始まってから何世紀も経て暗黒は我々を探し当てた。
E fu la fine di tutto. Ma fu anche un inizio.
So welcome. My name is Tom Slattery. I am the localization manager at Bungie, and I'm here today to talk about how we delivered the universe of Destiny into the hands of millions of players in a way that would hopefully make them feel like it was one that was created for them. So there's 4 main topics that I want to talk about today. The first one is how we went about building a world that would not only be as immersive as possible for everyone playing the game, no matter what language they were playing in or where they were in the world, but also one that would be easy for us to create and maintain. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is what we did beyond that in terms of supporting the localized player experience, the things that we did to make the game even better for players in other languages, even though we didn't need to do them for English. The third thing I'm just going to touch on briefly, but was our approach to localization for web and mobile. Destiny has a mobile companion that is spread across web, iOS, and Android. So we also had to think about localization for that. And I think there's some things that we did there that are kind of interesting and possibly applicable to other people. So I want to touch briefly on that. And then the last thing is our approach to staffing for localization on Destiny, what we did, why we did it, and what it allowed us to accomplish. So how do you build a world for the entire world? We had some unique challenges with Destiny. One of the first things that we had to think about was the fact that the setting is essentially a real-world setting. Obviously, if you've played Destiny, it's set in the future. There's gratuitous space magic, but it's our solar system. It's the real world. Parts of the game take place on Earth, albeit in the future. So if you have a fantasy series, something that's completely made up, like take Dune or Game of Thrones, it's set on a world that doesn't really exist. You can kind of suspend disbelief. You can have everyone speaking English, and that works. In Destiny, it's set on Earth and in our solar system. We have a real world, and our real world has real languages. So we have to be consistent with reality while also making the experience work for the players who are playing it. The other challenge is that it's a shared universe. So in Destiny, you could potentially be playing in the same place, in the same space, with someone else who's playing the game in a different language, in a different country. So we always had to keep that in mind too. So one of the philosophical questions that pops up as soon as you start thinking about that, when you have players that are occupying the same spaces, is, do they see the world in the same way? How do their eyes perceive it? Do they see the same thing when they look at it? And the answer, at least for Destiny, is yes. We decided very early on, the decision was actually made before I started at Bungie, that we wouldn't localize any art assets. We wouldn't localize any textures or graphics in the game. And that wasn't to say that we would just give a decidedly American gesture to everyone playing in other languages. It just meant that we were going to take a very calculated approach in how we built the world so that we wouldn't need to. So why did we do that? There's a few reasons. The obvious first one is the resource drain. There's a cost associated with creating those extra assets. And I don't just mean a cost in terms of like dollars and cents cost. There's a cost to the project. In any project, you have limited amounts of time, resources in terms of people, artists, and money. So when you think about how you're going to use that, all things being equal, personally, I would rather have an artist spend his or her time making more cool things to put in the game or polishing the stuff that's in there, rather than creating the same rusty sign in 7 languages. And I'm a loc guy, so I usually get off on that stuff. But beyond that, there's also a couple of very concrete reasons why we decided that it wouldn't make sense for us to localize art. The first one is what I touched on before. It's a shared universe. So players exist in the same space. And the moment that you show 2 players who are in the same virtual space different things, you're essentially lying to those players. There's a glitch in the matrix. It's an inconsistent world. And we didn't want to create an inconsistent world. We wanted to create a persistent universe that was believable. So you can imagine a situation, if you've played Destiny, strikes are basically cooperative, repeatable missions that you can jump in and play with friends over and over. So you can imagine a situation where on a Friday night, I ping my buddy in Japan, and you know, he gets on, and we jump into a strike together, and we're playing. And we get to a certain point where he's like, okay, I need you to focus on that guy with the red dots on his armor. I'm going to go take care of those other dudes. And I'm like, dude, I have absolutely where are you? What's going on? I don't even see a guy with red dots on it, but this Stars and Stripes guy's kicking my ass. So you can think of situations like that. I mean, obviously that's a little bit exaggerated, but you could think of things like a sign on the top of a building that you're using as a waypoint, or maybe you get separated from your friend and you're trying to describe the things you see, so you spell off, you know, a logo that's on the side of a building or something like that. And those sorts of things are where it breaks down when you have players in the same space. The other reason is, again, something I touched on before, the real-world setting, and also the fiction that builds off of that. So, for example, parts of the game take place in old Russia. When you're in old Russia, obviously signs are in Russian, because that's what they speak in Russia. And there's also fictional backstory behind the other destinations that you go to in the game. So, fictionally, in Destiny, there is a base on the moon, and that was developed by China. So all the signage for the moon base is in Chinese. We also have colonies that are on Mars and Venus, and these are fictionally English-speaking colonies, so all the signage there is in English. The one thing that I would point out there is it's very easy to fall into the trap of being an American developer or being someone who only speaks English and naturally just wanting to make everything fictionally English because it's easier. If that were the case throughout the entire game, the end result for players is that it still is going to feel like a half-localized experience. You might be able to justify it fictionally all you want, but when you jump into the game playing in French and you're seeing everything you look at in English, it doesn't really jive. So the way that it actually turned out in our game, you start off initially in old Russia, and then you go to the moon. So you're getting this progression of Russian text on signs and then Chinese text on signs. And by the time you make it to Mars and Venus, as a player, you've kind of been trained. You know that that information is not gameplay relevant. You know that you don't need to pay attention to the signs, that it's basically decoration. So it builds the atmosphere and fiction of the world, but it still doesn't give that impression that we just didn't localize it because we didn't want to. It's clear that it's an intentional fictional decision. So there were, of course, some challenges associated with this. One of the big ones is working with text in languages that you don't have support for is very difficult. And just about everything that can go wrong will and did. So we had things like concept artists who decided to go off and they wanted to make some Chinese concept art. So they pulled out Chinese propaganda posters on Google, started picking characters at random. You know, nothing that actually was problematic. It was just gibberish, but the kind of thing that makes you really nervous. We had things where maybe something like that happened, and then the designer actually provided an updated version for artists to implement that had correct Chinese or Russian text on it. But the artist who went to implement it noticed it was different from the original concept art and corrected it back to what it was, or that sort of thing. We also had Russian signage, for example, where the text got flipped upside down or backwards, which is a really easy mistake to make because Russian is basically just like the English alphabet with half the characters turned backwards. But if you don't speak Russian, it's really hard to notice that sort of thing. So we ended up, in the end, having to go through and have testers take screenshots in the environment of every instance of foreign language text and send it off for review through professional Russian and Chinese game translators to make sure that everything worked in context, was implemented correctly, and wasn't offensive, which was another problem we encountered because it turns out you might have something that's perfectly fine, but then you put some dirt and rust on the sign and cover up a few characters and suddenly it says something different. Like you could imagine in English a sign that said wanted assassin where the end of the word gets a little bit obscured and it says something very different. So yeah, we had those kind of problems, quite a few actually, that we had to fix. Another problem that we had was something, like I mentioned before, having mostly English-speaking developers, there's sort of this bias, this natural tendency to go English with everything. So there was English everywhere in the game. We had things like people wanting to put English translations on all the signs that were in other languages, or just wanting to put English signs everywhere because they wanted more text. And the biggest challenge of all was the tower. If you haven't played Destiny, the tower is sort of our hub space, our social space where players go back between missions. So in the early versions of the tower, we had essentially guideposts that would tell you where all of the things in the tower were. There was no mini-map or anything like that. So your only way of really getting information about where things were, other than exploring the whole space, was to go up to the signs and read them. So early on, this is an early concept that we had. The design of the tower has gone through a lot of iteration over the past few years before launch. So at this point in time, the tower contained 3 different sectors, basically, that we had called the Underwatch, the Military District, and the Bazaar. And each of these areas had different factions in it. Each one was associated with a different player class. So, you know, the hangout for the Titans was in the Underwatch and that sort of thing. So the basic art that they had created for that was a big capital letter that was the first letter of the name of the section, so U for Underwatch, which makes perfect sense when you're playing in English, and the word for Underwatch starts with a U. Then the name of it in English underneath, and the list of all the NPCs and vendors and things that you could find in that area. Which again, if you're playing in any other language than English, isn't really helpful, because none of that means anything. The names of those areas are going to be translated, so Underwatch won't be Underwatch. The names of the classes have been translated, so Titans aren't necessarily Titans. It's basically just not helpful. And if that's the only way that players are getting that information, then you're basically failing to convey important gameplay information to other players in other languages. So we took another stab at it, and this was the next iteration of that, where we said, okay, we can't use the acronym approach. We can't take the first letter of each one. Let's just call these sectors like Sector A, B, and C, because that makes sense to anyone who sees it. So this is, you know, Sector B here, which is the military district, the former military district. Let's just put all the languages on there. So let's just translate it into all the languages that we support in Destiny and throw all those on a sign. And this is Google Translation, by the way, so if the thing in Russian says something offensive, I'm very sorry. I should have probably checked that. But there's some problems with this, too. You've got a whole bunch of languages, which makes it really difficult as a player to walk up to the sign and get the information that you need. Like, even in this example, I think there's 6 here. But if you're looking at 6 different languages that say the same thing, it's a lot of information. You kind of have to scan through and go, oh, there's the one I can read. That's the little tidbit of information I need. It's also not sustainable, right? Like, if we want to add more languages over time, if we, you know, tomorrow decided to add another language to Destiny, we'd have to go through and either update all this art or not provide that information to players in that language, which would be kind of terrible. And what do you do if we end up with like 10 or 12 languages? Then suddenly you can't even squeeze that much stuff onto a sign. So we didn't really like that approach. Artistically, I mean, the art team also just didn't like it because it's messy. It doesn't look good. So some challenging problems there. The other problem that I mentioned was English everywhere, and that was something that we very much had in the tower. This is an example of a very early build. One of my favorite games when I started working at Bungie was to prop a new build every morning and go into the tower and see how much more English text the artists had put all over everything. So this is actually from an email I used to take screenshots and send to my manager who used to handle localization at Bungie and vent and get angry. Obviously, you can tell I'm a loc guy. This was a build before our character heads were rendering. So I'm running around in the tower. My character has no head. And the thing that I'm really upset about is the tiny little wording beneath the picture on the sign. But this is an example where that one might be kind of hard to read up there, but it says New Monarchy. New Monarchy is one of the factions in Destiny. But in other languages, it's not New Monarchy. In French, it might be Nouveau Monarchie or something. I don't actually speak French. And it's also just kind of, it breaks immersion. It's weird that you're playing the game, for example, in German. You're in the tower. All of the characters are speaking German. All of the signs are in English. It doesn't really make sense. Like, fictionally, if you're playing the game in Italian, for you, the tower is an Italian space. The characters speak Italian. So you would want things to be in Italian, right? So how do we solve this? We've got this decision that we're not going to localize any art. We've got a setting that contains a mix of languages. We've got this tower that's a kind of complex problem where we need to make it feel like home for everyone. How do we go about setting rules to make sure that everybody has a good experience? The first is, do not communicate any important information through text and graphics. So there can't be anything like a this way sign. Like the guideposts are a good example. Any information like that that needs to be communicated to players needs to be communicated in some other way. So through the UI, which can be localized, through dialogue, through some kind of visual cues in the environment that give that information to players without spelling it out. Next is avoiding what I call Anglocentrism. This is the thing that I was talking about before, that trap that it's really easy to fall into when you only speak a particular language. Don't just put everything in English. Try to show, I mean, we have a world that has diversity of language, so show that in the game. Try to show that we have multiple languages in this universe wherever you can. Avoid putting English translation on things just because you can. The problem with that is that same thing where suddenly, instead of having this diversity of language, you're showing again that this is a game that was made for people who speak English, but you can play it too. And that's not the impression that we want to give people. And also just don't use English text where you don't have to. I mean, it's fine if there's some text here and there, but if it's everywhere, it starts to be that constant reminder, that sort of constant slap in the face reminder that this game wasn't really made for you. The third, which is very important, was solving the problem of how to make the tower feel like home for everyone. Because again, the tower is our hub space. It's fictionally where all of the characters, which we call guardians, are from. That's where they live. It's your home. And it would be very strange to return home and find a place where you didn't really feel like you felt a part of the community, It wasn't for you. So we needed to make it feel like an international space somehow. We need to give all players the impression that this is not just a place where English speakers live. This is a place that is filled with a lot of different people. It's the last city on Earth, so it makes sense that there's a cultural mix there. Fourth, this is the one I mentioned before, absolutely avoid defacing or obscuring text on signs. We had quite a few issues with this, and we eventually just made the rule that any text in a foreign language or English on a sign needed to be kept the way that it was originally created and not covered up in any way that could make it say something else. It's very important in this situation because if you make the decision not to localize art, even if you're just putting up signs in English, you need to make sure that that English text doesn't mean genitalia in Italian or that sort of thing. You need to run each example of signage through all of the languages you support to make sure that it works for them. And finally, no references to the English terminology, things like taking the first letter of the term in English, which may not be the same in another language, or putting the names of factions up on signs where that name would actually be something different in another language. So there are some things that we purposefully decided that we would not localize, like the weapon foundry names, the names of our NPCs in the game, that are the same across all languages and give us things that are safe to use. But for the most part, all terminology in the game gets localized. Almost. This is my badge of shame. This is my one big localization fail on Destiny. This was already on a t-shirt in our store when I started working at Bungie, so it was kind of a little bit too late. It was all over the tower. But this is the logo for one of our other factions called the Future War Cult. And obviously the logo is an acronym for Future War Cult. You can probably imagine translating Future War Cult into 7 other languages in a way that preserves the meaning and also happens to start with the initials FWC is not achievable. So some languages fared a little better than others, but FWC only really works for a couple of them. So most of our languages, the logo here doesn't actually match the term for the faction name, and that's kind of sad if you're a localization person. We do, if you've played the game, there's also an alternate logo, which is just the F. And one of the solutions I propose to try to mitigate that in the future is let's just try to use that one where we can, because that does work for most languages. Future in most European languages still starts with an F, so that one doesn't feel as off as FWC. So how did we go about solving all of the problems in the tower? One thing that we did was pull out information that we needed into the UI. So like I said before, originally we had no map in the tower. The only way you were getting the information about where things were was to go look at those guideposts. So we actually pulled that out and we did implement a map. And the map is all UI, so we're able to localize that and provide that information to players in all languages. So you can pull up a map of the tower, see what the different areas are called, see what the different vendors and things are in that space. So any of that critical information needs to go in there. You can't rely on the environment art to provide that to players. Another thing we did was try to lean on iconography wherever we can. So teach players what icons mean and then use those rather than putting the text for it. So this is the final New Monarchy faction space in the tower that we actually shipped. And you can see on the left, it still has that triangular logo for New Monarchy, but instead of saying New Monarchy under it, it just stops there. And players know that because they've seen that symbol a lot. They know it's associated with the faction. There's no reason to put a sign on the wall. Another thing that we did to cut down just on the amount of English text, one of the problems with cutting out all text together is human beings use text. So if you just cut all of the text out of an environment, it starts to feel fake. It doesn't feel like a real inhabited human space. So part of the pushback that I got from the artistic side on removing text was just that. They still wanted to be able to use text in their designs to make the space look inhabited. So one of the things that we did was try to find things that were globally palatable. So for example, the names of the weapon foundries, like I mentioned, we kept the same across all languages. We made sure that those names would work in all the languages we were shipping. So things you can see in that image like Omolan and Suros, those are some of our weapon foundries, and we use a lot of those on labels and things to just add some text for decoration. We also use things like industrial gibberish, so just numbers and letters that don't mean anything, labels on a crate, so that it feels like a real object, but it doesn't necessarily say something. It doesn't remind people that it's all English, because it's not. It's just numbers and letters. Latin is also easy to fall back on, because Latin's just cool, and nobody knows what it says. And the U's are V's, and it's Latin. So we put a little of that in there, too, in places. And we did actually go back to using some multilingual signage. So this is how that guidepost ended up in the final tower. We don't rely on it anymore. It's basically just decorative because there's a map. You can find out where the stuff is without reading this. But artistically, we just decided to narrow it down to 3 languages. We just went with English, Brazilian Portuguese, and Japanese. So it does what we want. It accomplishes the idea of telling people this is an international space. There are not only English speakers here or only speakers of whatever language you're playing the game in and hearing. This is a space inhabited by lots of different people. But it also solves the problem of us not needing to redo all of the art if we ever add another language or anything like that. So how did we arrive at those decisions? Well, mostly through a lot of challenging compromise. And I think that's it's important to have those healthy discussions about what's important for localization, but then what does that mean in terms of art or story or that sort of thing. So a lot of these decisions came about after a lot of discussion with a lot of people. So one example of that is what we call the human colonial palette, the set of textures that gets used on Venus and Mars, where all the text is English. Like I said before, if that had been the decision for everything, that every space in the game was just fictionally English, that wouldn't have worked. And I would have protested that decision. But because of the way we present this in the game, it works. And so I think this was a good place to just say, you know what, it's okay that both of those spaces are English, because it's not really a problem the way it is right now. Another example is the multilingual tower signage. That was a compromise in the end of going back and forth, having a lot of discussions with the art team about what looks good and what's sustainable and things like that. And we ended up with something that I think accomplishes what both sides wanted, which is giving that impression of a multicultural society that lives in the city, but also not putting every single language on the wall. Another one that I hadn't talked about was we used to have a lot of text on our weapons. That was another thing I used to take screenshots of all the time and send in angry emails. All English, of course, but you'd get things that were literally in your face. Almost every scope on every gun had English text on it that was very often associated with the city, things like city armory, blah, blah, blah. So again, it's feeding that impression that the city is an English-speaking city, which doesn't jive with what people are getting when they're playing the game in another language. So we looked at that, and we ended up making pretty good compromises. We tried to pull it off where it was extremely visible like that. We left some text in places. There's things like on the safety of a weapon, F and S for fire and safe are used generally by international weapons manufacturers, so it's normal to see that even though it's English. So we kept things like that. And we didn't remove all of the text because there's some weapons that have, the names of the weapon manufacturers, which some of those are not English words. So you get a nice mix and it's not all over the place. So we did cut out a lot of it. We tried to remove anything that fictionally wouldn't work in relation to the tower in the city, but we left some of it. And another one that was kind of similar was the opening cinematic for the game. So if you've played Destiny, there's this opening movie, which you're about to see, where there's some astronauts walking on Mars, and it has text in it. And our initial plan was just to render out the video in 7 languages, and everything was fine, and we did that. It wasn't going to be a problem. And then all of a sudden, at one point, we didn't have enough space on disk, and it was a problem. So, of course, the art team said, yeah, you're going to have to subtitle that. And I said, well, we could do that. But then, again, this is the first thing that players see when they pop in the game, is this opening movie. And the impression that they're going to get is, this is a game that was made for English speakers, and I have to watch it with subtitles, which is not a very good impression. So the compromise that we made was to alter the artistic direction of the video a little bit to work in multiple languages. Again, just a sampling, but where it would appear to be an artistic choice, and players who spoke one of the languages that were in there would be getting that information through there. And players for the other languages where we did have to throw in a subtitle wouldn't think that it was, oh, well, this is just an American game and that's why it's this way. It's, oh, well, this is the artistic direction and they have these 3 languages in there, but they're providing this information because not all players speak those languages. So here's where we landed in the end. So, I mean, we don't really explain it. And as a player, you can sort of interpret that however you want. There's 3 astronauts, there's 3 languages. Maybe they're from different countries and speak different languages. It's kind of up to you to interpret, but it solved the problem. It didn't make the first thing that players see an English-only experience. So I basically told you that I was going to give a talk about localizing Destiny, and I've spent half an hour basically explaining how we didn't localize Destiny. So I'm going to actually switch modes now and talk about the things that we did do. How did we go about making the game better for players in other languages? So one of the big differences between Destiny and the games that Bungie had been making, like Halo, was that you can create your own character and invest very, very deeply in it. So in Halo, you were Master Chief. Master Chief was you. Master Chief was a dude. In Destiny, you don't have to be a dude. You can create a character, you can choose your race, your class, your perks, your weapons, your gear, and your gender. So if you're a player playing the game in English, the gender choice doesn't really have a lot of impact. It changes the voice for your character, it changes your model, but that's basically it. It's a cosmetic decision. In other languages, that's not the case, especially for Romance languages like French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. The very concept of gender is built into the language and the grammar. So once you make that decision to play a female character, you suddenly need things to be said differently about your character than they would be if you were playing a male character. So as an example, here is French. So the English term guardian. In French, you've got le and you've got la. There's no gender-neutral way to refer to a guardian. You're either a male guardian or you're a female guardian. Same thing with like class names. You've got hunter is chasseur or chasseuse. So we basically are presented with a choice. We can either stick our head in the sand here and just ignore that this problem even exists and just refer to everyone as a dude, or we can implement things to actually support and affirm the choice that we've allowed players to make. And that sounded more difficult, so we went with that. So here's a quick example in Italian.
Buongiorno, guardiana. Buongiorno, guardiana.
Probably a little bit subtle and hard to pick up if you don't speak Italian, but Italian, the male version of guardian is guardiano, and the female version is guardiana. So depending on which gender character you're playing, the other NPCs in the tower will actually address you with the correct gender. So in terms of implementation, how we went about doing that, there's better and worse ways to do it. we wanted to do it in a way that wouldn't have huge like memory impacts. We didn't want to do anything dumb like just duplicate the set of lines that are used for male players to female, and if one of them needed to be different, put a different wave file in. Like that would waste a lot of space. So for actual implementation, what we did was we have dialogue sequences in our game. So for a given dialogue sequence, we look through each language, and for any line in that sequence, if even one language needs a female version of a line, we create a branch node. So that line of dialogue will branch for male and female. So if you're looking at this example here, English, we generally don't use this. So the English dialogue sequence, it has a branch for male and female on the second line, but it doesn't actually use that. It's the same as the male line. For the French dialogue sequence, it does. So on the English one, all it does on the female node is just point to the male line. So there's not a duplicate. It's just referencing the other dialogue event. And then for the other lines where there were no female versions, you just have a single node, a single line of dialogue. And then at runtime, we filter based on the cause of the trigger of that dialogue event, which is generally the player's character. So we look at the gender of the cause and play the correct line. So a lot of games don't do this. Most games actually don't do this. But we thought it was very important because that idea of creating and investing in your character is fundamental to Destiny. You put a lot of time into building that character. And actually, I talked to a lot of people. I talked to a lot of gamer friends, European friends, translators and whatnot, about their own feelings. And the thing that I just kept hearing over and over again was, yeah, most games don't do this, but whenever I play a game and I choose a female character and it actually respects that, I just think it's so awesome. And we wanted to be awesome. So we've supported this throughout our entire game in the dialogue system. So anywhere from random NPC lines to story, mission dialogue, that sort of thing. If you're playing a female character, that should actually be respected. And if it's not, it's a bug, and please tell me about it. The other thing that we did, initially in our dialogue system, we had some pretty nasty restrictions. Our mission dialogue lines needed to be exactly the same length as English, which if you've done any kind of translation, you know is not fun. To make a line in another language match exactly with the language you're translating from, as a translator, first of all, is just challenging because naturally the way that you say things is going to be longer or shorter. So you might have to pad a line with some fluff. You might have to cut out some information. You might just need to write a line of dialogue that's pretty awkward or force the actor to rush through it to fit it in the amount of time because there's no way to cut it down. But it also adds a lot of cost. When you go into recording, it's the same problem. The actor in a normal recording session can just read a line, and if it sounds good, you move on. But when you're trying to match length of another language, you have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and try to get it to work. And when it doesn't work, then you might have to have someone rewrite it on the fly or you know, add some padding in or try to stretch it out and see if it doesn't sound too weird when you do that, you know, with audio processing. So we fixed that. We decided that was not a restriction we wanted to put in place. So our mission dialogue can now be free length. The only dialogue actually in the game that needs to match English was our cinematic dialogue because there's motion capture and you need to match the actual things that are happening on screen. So there's a little bit of restriction there. But we were able to get rid of the rest. The other thing that we put a lot of effort into was making sure that the UI supported what we need for localization. So we actually did a lot of early work, throwaway translation, just so that we could get real text in the game in all languages and test out every part of the UI. So we just took like a file or two here and there for each portion of the UI, got it translated and started looking at what worked and what didn't. And some of the things that we noticed very early on were there weren't enough space for item names. Our UI, if you can see in the little purple box there, it capitalizes all item names, which makes the text wider, which means you have less space to begin with. And a lot of our item names in the game use compound words or possessives or things. So when you have something like Dustwalker boots and translate that into French, where you can't use compound words, it turns into something like boots of the walker of the dust or something like that, which gets really long. So what we realized was we could probably find a way to make that work for Destiny. We could just call them dust boots in French or walker boots in French. But this isn't just one game. This is an IP that we wanted to span a decade or more. So we had to think long term, and that wasn't a situation we wanted to get ourselves into. We wanted to make sure that we were doing things right. So we expanded it so that the UI will just automatically resize, and we can go up to a second line for localization languages. And we did that in most places in the UI. If you look at the tooltips there, anywhere the text gets longer in another language, it automatically resizes. We implemented font scaling, so if we have to, we generally try to avoid it because it's not as pretty, but if the text is just too long to fit, it'll scale down a pixel or two so that you can actually squeeze it in. Yeah, scaling everything essentially in the UI. And the next part I want to touch on a little bit, like I mentioned at the beginning, was our approach to web and mobile localization. When I came into Bungie, we had an English-only website. There was a new website in development that rolled out shortly thereafter, which had locales built into it. It was intended to be localized, but naturally had never been localized or tested in any way. So we had to think about how we wanted to implement localization for the website and get it working. So challenges that we had, things that we were thinking about when we sat down to spec out how it would work, was we knew we were always going to be lagging behind English a little bit in terms of translation. It's always going to take time. Our community and marketing team tends to post very timely information. They move very quickly, so things are always coming in pretty hot. And we knew it would never be possible to keep up with things in 6 other languages on the same timeline. So we wanted a system that would be flexible, where we could get stuff out as soon as it was possible, but still make sure that people are having a good experience without that. The other problem was that we had no real tools support at all. We had a content publishing system that was designed to create English content and post it to the web, but there was no concept of localization in there. When an item got updated, if you went in and updated it in English, we had no way to know that that had happened. We had no way to track what had been translated in the system and what hadn't been translated. And we also have, essentially, not all of the game strings, but most of the text in the game also used for web and mobile. If you've used the Destiny companion at all, you can look at your character, so you can see items and their names and the flavor text. You can look at missions and their descriptions and all of that kind of stuff. So the bulk of the text from the game is also used for web and mobile. That, fortunately, turned out not to be an issue for localization, just because of the way it was set up to begin with. Our website pulls that content from a build of the game. So whenever we update the game with a patch or something, we have a new content build that contains the text that the website can then use. So that's something that we didn't have to worry about at all for localization, thankfully. Because if we didn't have that, you get in the situation where you have 2 sets of duplicate content over here, and it's very easy for something to get updated and changed and to forget to go back and do it on the other one. So how we solved the big problem there with our content publishing system was, first of all, to implement localization queues. So anytime that a particular piece of content got updated or created in English, it would go into the queue for each of the other languages. So each language had its own queue that could work at its own pace, go through and translate items, submit them, push them out onto the web. Within that, I mean, we've iterated on this for a couple of years now, so it's gained a lot of functionality. But within each of those queues, we now also have priority queues. So 5 different levels of priority, where if I'm going in and writing a piece of content in English, I can decide for myself basically the priority that I think should be assigned to this. I think this is super urgent and critical information to get out, so I'll mark it as priority number 1. Or this is something that, yeah, get to it when you have time, but it's not super critical. It's just a minor update, so maybe that's like a priority 4. And within each of those queues, then, an individual translator can go in and reassign. So if French has a huge backlog and a lot of things that are all set to priority 1, you could go through and say, well, yeah, these are all important, but these ones are more important, so I'll put these other ones in a lower priority queue. And the other thing that you can do whenever you're updating an item is add a note, a sort of revision history. So if I go in and update the English item 3 times, and then the Italian translator goes in to update his, he'll see the comments that I put in and see what has changed since the last update. And we also added import and export functionality to work with computer-assisted translation tools so that we have the benefits of translation memory when we're doing this stuff too. So the fundamental philosophy that we tried to apply when we were thinking about the localization of the site was that we wanted anyone who went to the site for the first time in, say, French, to experience a website that was fully localized in French. If you go to a lot of websites that are localized, you'll see a little flag at the top and you'll click on it, and maybe you click the French flag and like 3 words change to French and the rest of the website's still in English. And I don't like that. It's a big pet peeve of mine. So what I wanted was the best localized experience that we could provide by default. But what we also wanted to do was make it so that people had the option, if they speak English, or maybe they don't speak English, but they just want to see, like, you know, there are fans who might want to see a trailer the moment it comes out, even if it's not available in their language yet. We wanted to give people the ability to see the untranslated content too, if they so desired. But understanding that the vast majority of our customers don't speak multiple languages, so we don't want to just flood them with English content when they most likely don't speak it because they've actively selected a different language. So our solution to that problem was to implement English fallback settings. So each individual piece of content in our content system has a property of whether or not it should fall back to English if there's no localization available. So we have that on individual things like news articles, but we also have it on content sets, which are another content item, which is basically a container of other items. So using that, we're able to do some kind of interesting things. And then within each user's account settings, they have an option they can check to say, I want to see content in English if it's not translated yet. So between those things, we're able to do some kind of powerful and interesting things. So here's one example. Until very recently, our website had this top news set on it, where there would be the 3 spotlight news items we wanted to show to people. The iOS and Android apps still use this. So for this one, we would make the content set not fall back to English, because we would never want to be in a situation, for example, where we posted a new weekly update in English and it wasn't translated yet, but we decided to go ahead and throw that on the front page for English. We wouldn't want that to show up in other languages because it wasn't translated. So this is one where we curate the content. We don't fall back to English, and an individual translator can go in his or her language and say, these are the 3 things that I want to display in my language. These are the 3 most recent, most relevant articles that are available in my language. Then the other pattern that we use is this one. This is what we use, for example, on our help site, where we have a set of the trending help articles. So the most generally useful or relevant things for users. Maybe something happens in the middle of the night and we need to post information for people. This is one where, it changes pretty frequently. So on the localization side, due to staffing, which I'll get into later, we don't want to be responsible for having to update this all the time. But also, in general, at least for help information, I think it's better to give that to people even if it's not translated yet. If there's something critical that's going on, I think being able to get that information and at least Google Translate it, I just said a dirty word, but I think that's better than nothing. So for this one, we've made the active choice that this one will fall back to English. So the set of items that's displayed is always the set of items that's displayed for English. But there are situations where we want to remove some of them. So for example, our game is only available on Sony platforms in Japan. So on the Japanese version of the website, if there's a help article about Xbox, it doesn't make sense to show that. So we mark that one not to fall back to English. Don't localize it for Japanese and it disappears. So quick example of that. This is a snapshot of our website from last month. So here we've got a weekly update that was posted on February 12th. And beneath that, there is a content set of calendar events that are upcoming. So it looks like 5 of them for English. When you look at the website in German, now we have the spotlight item being the weekly update from the week before. So the English one was just posted. It hasn't been translated into German yet, so it just shows the most recent one that we do have for that language. The calendar set beneath it also, there is one item that had just been added, hadn't been localized into German yet, so that one isn't displayed. But it's okay. As a user going to the German site, nothing seems wrong. Unless you actively go to English and see that there's something different, you're getting the most recent information that's available in your language. But if you are a user who speaks both German and English and you've set your account to show you that content, this is the view that you'd get. So because there is a more recent article that hasn't been translated, suddenly the spotlight news item becomes that one in English. The calendar shows you all of the events that are translated in German, but the one that was not translated yet also shows up. So part of the reason that we did things this way was because of the situation we have for staffing. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to take you on a journey into the distant past, 2012 to be exact. So in 2012, Bungie had no localization staff at all. We had an English-only website, mobile apps. We had games that were only coming out on a single console. So things were simpler then. Today, we've got a fully staffed localization team. We have a game that we're supporting that's a live game with frequent patches and releases and things like that. We have apps in 7 languages, and those are the website and the mobile apps have 2-week sprint release cycles where we're constantly updating them. So altogether, it says 7 platforms up there. I mean, we have 4 consoles, and then we're also supporting web, iOS, and Android. So 7 separate platforms that we're supporting for localization altogether. So I want to talk a little bit about how we went about doing that in terms of staffing. So for Destiny, we used basically a hybrid staffing model. We had me, internal localization manager. We had external translators that were in country working externally. We had an internal localization editor working at Bungie, 1 per language. And we had internal testers also at Bungie, 1 per language. And 1 per language is pretty small. But like I said, we were able to start early and do a lot of early iteration that made it so essentially when we got to the end of the project, there weren't a lot of things to fix. So things like getting that translation in early and fixing the problems in the UI meant when we got to localization, almost all the problems that we had were things we could fix in translation. We didn't have to ask for features and support for that sort of thing. We were able to get in at a stage where it was still early enough to solve the problems. So localization editors, this was an idea that was already in place before I joined Bungie. But the basic idea would be to have someone who would be the main tester for that language, but was also capable of doing translation. So when we got to the end of the project, if we needed very quick turnaround on things, we would have someone in-house who could do that translation. Hearing stories from the past at Bungie, one of the problems for them in terms of localization had always been not being able to turn things around quickly enough, because Bungie is a company that likes to iterate and do things. If there's even a little bit of time left where they can make something better, they want to. So very often at the end of the project, there are changes going in. Something, Jason Jones, something, pistols or something. Anyway, things go in where we need quick turnaround, and if we don't have the ability to do it, we can't make improvements to the game or we can't fix a bug. So that was the basic idea. That's not actually how it worked out. We've ended up using our localization editors for a lot of things. So we have them doing all of our web and mobile translation. So all of that is done internally. The actual builds of the website and the apps, but also all of the content that gets published is done by that person. We have the ability to, like I've talked about, work on things before they're really ready for localization. So being able to go in and do that early translation meant we were able to make changes to the UI while the UI was still being developed. So rather than having to make people go back and repeat work, we were just able to identify problems for localization and make sure that the UI, the final UI, when it was implemented, supported those things. We also have done all of the game translation up to at least the capacity of our team. So almost for the past year, not quite a year now, but most of the past year we've supported all the game translation internally too. So after we did the bulk of the translation on Destiny, we took back ownership of the text in-house. We closed out the game. We've done all of the feature work for patches. Our first expansion that came out last year, we translated in-house. And at least so far, we've been able to keep up with everything internally. We've also been able to use localization editors to do all of our testing between the major releases. So again, being a live game with patches, there are things that are constantly being added that require a little bit of translation, maybe a little feature here that has some text associated with it, or a bug fix over here that needs something changed in all languages. So there's not a lot of test work. It doesn't really justify keeping a full-time test team for localization all the time, but having those people who speak the languages in-house means that we're able to still do that internally. And finally, and probably one of the most important things is that they review and edit everything that's done externally. So we essentially have a single funnel point where everything flows through for each language. So there's someone who is ensuring that the translation is consistent, the quality is consistent. If something's done externally, you might have something that references, for example, a line of dialogue in the game. And a translator who hasn't worked on the game might not realize that, so they translate it a little differently than it actually appears in the game. Having people in-house means that they'll catch that sort of thing and actually be able to preserve those references, keep up the quality, because they're intimately familiar with the game and with Bungie. So benefits of having an internal team. One of the biggest ones, and the reason that Bungie wanted localization editors to begin with, is agility. It means that we can do things very quickly. If someone comes up with an idea in the afternoon, generally 9 times out of 10, we can get it done in all languages the same day. Obviously, sometimes people are sick or on vacation or whatever, but most of the time we're able to turn things around very, very quickly. Another one is security. Bungie is a company who is very, very tight on security and does not do things like send builds outside of the building. If you work in localization, you can probably imagine not having access to the game that you're translating makes things very challenging. On Destiny, we flew over the external translators for a week to play through everything and get familiar with the game, so they at least had a sense of what they were doing. But having that person in-house then who can check everything that comes in and communicate information, recognize where people are misinterpreting things, and provide more context to the translators is very, very valuable. And finally, quality, which is, what all that kind of comes back to. Having that single person who has a vested interest in making things better, and no conflict of interest either. When you're working with external translators, external translators are great too, and I haven't met one ever who isn't passionate about what they do, but they're kind of in the position of being forced to do what they think you want, which is generally translate things very quickly and don't ask too many questions and send it back. Whereas if you have someone internal, they will actually point out when you do the things that you shouldn't be doing, and they will fight for the things that should be fought for. So it's a person who will be very steeped in the game and care about it and ensure that the quality of everything that's done for it stays high. So that's another big gain. So the other thing that I've been asked to remind you is there are evaluations that will be sent to you after this talk, so please, they're electronic, so check your spam folder and be sure to fill those out. And also, Bungie is hiring. We are hiring for localization. We're hiring for many, many disciplines. And one of our recruiters, I actually spy in the back of the room. So if you have any interest in coming to work for a really awesome company and doing awesome things, feel free to come up and talk to me or talk to Jessica in the back. She'll be happy to give you more information. But thank you very much. I think we have about 7 minutes for questions, so if anyone has any, feel free to go up. Yeah. Can you give me just a quick introduction, your name and
Hi,
who you are?
My name is Jack Ward-Fincham. I'm a producer from Europe.
Yeah.
And for anybody who is working in localization, I worked in localization for years before living in a country that wasn't localized to my needs, and it taught me a hell of a lot about what I should expect out of localization. That was great. I've got a question. You support 7 languages, two of which were a form of Chinese and Japanese. Is that correct?
No, so the question is what languages we support. We support English and then French, Italian, German, Spanish, Brazilian, Portuguese, and Japanese.
Okay. So within Japanese particularly, there are obviously nearly 10,000 individual characters.
Yeah.
All of which you probably don't want to load into memory in your font, lest kill it. So what techniques did your team use to minimize the memory footprint of your localization process?
That would be a better question for a UI engineer. I want to say that it actually turned out not to be a problem this time. I know in the past when I've talked to them about that, on past titles they've done things like actually scan the strings in the game and see what glyphs are actually used and only put those into the font set to conserve memory. I want to say that we were able to have the whole Japanese font in memory, but you would have to ask someone who is not me because I don't actually do the coding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Juan Pablo. I work in Cartoon Network Latin America.
Hi.
First, I want to thank you for the talk and congratulate you guys on a job amazingly well done.
Thank you.
It's so good, actually, that Zur is a dick in any language. So good job. But one thing that I thought was really interesting, do these localization, how do you call them, editors?
Yeah.
Had access to the main development teams, especially the writers? Because I noticed in the Spanish, at least the Spanish localization, it's really, really very good. And there's a lot of things that were adapted. Not necessarily they're not as literal as they could be, but they really make sense in the context of the game. So I was wondering if they actually did interact with the
the external. So the question is, did our translators have access to the writing team and to be able to ask questions and things? The external translators did not, except that they did have access to us, who could then ask the writing team. But Bungie is, I mean, we're essentially a big open floor plan studio, so everyone can talk to everyone. So yeah, the localization team, the editors that we have in-house go to talk to the writing team all the time. So we have pretty much free access to anyone, which is really, really nice.
But there wasn't a centralized process to have that happen?
Not a super centralized process. I mean, we did, because we have so many languages, we didn't want to have 6 people asking the writers the same questions, so we do things like build a spreadsheet where we put the questions in, and then, once a day or once every couple of days, send that to the writing team to get answers. But I mean, a lot of stuff just happens organically too. You run into someone by the coffee machine and have a conversation about something you were wondering or that sort of thing.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
Sorry, over here.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Miguel Cordy. I work for Capcom. I'm the manager of the localization group there.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, a lot of the problems you were highlighting here are the same things we face every day.
Yep.
And we do have an internal team, especially with FIGs, to
Yeah.
handle all those problems that arise. So my question isn't really localization based. I'm more curious about your source language, English. Who's editing the English? Who is watching the writers? Do you leave that to your QA team? What happens when you find mistakes in the English? I'm sure your internal localizers are very vociferous about finding mistakes in English because it impedes their language. So who handles that over at Bungie?
Yeah, so the question is who checks the English content? And the answer is we're sort of in the process of changing how that works. We just hired a copy editor, so we're kind of implementing a new process there. But it's always been the case that anyone can report anything. So the localization team definitely, like, translators see every bit of text in the game very closely and have to understand it. So like you're saying, it's very often translators who find the bugs in English and report them. And yeah, they did. I mean, anyone in the studio can file bugs on things, so they would file bugs or just give a heads up to the writer that they knew were and was in charge of that particular bit of content.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, hi. I'm kind of curious what your approach is to localization of some of the legendary and exotic names of things like Dr. Nope and The Devil You Know, and how do you handle that as that's translated into other languages, and does that affect how you kind of name things in English that might not translate as well?
No, we don't give them any restrictions in English. So I mean, English is what English is, and then we find the best way to deal with it in other languages. How do we go about translating things like exotics? I hire good people, and I basically trust them. So I basically give our editors a lot of flexibility to name things in their language the way that they need to make it good. I mean, there's a lot of things like, Dr. Nope. It's not going to directly translate, but maybe you can come up with a similar name that captures that theme or that idea and works for a French audience. So it's kind of play it by ear.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Lauren. I am getting my MBA in localization management, and I'm a freelance Japanese English proofreader. I have 2 questions. One of them is that you said that you rely sort of on iconography. Do you do any culturalization of that or any checking to make sure that the images that you're using are appropriate for those markets? And also, in terms of your web development and the web portals, do you use sort of a global gateway, or how do you address people coming into that for the first time and being able to adjust their language settings?
So a couple questions there. So the first one is iconography. How do we go about making sure that the icons and images we're using are okay for other regions? We have a geopolitical review process where, I mean, we send stuff off. So all textures in the game, all those assets go off to people to be reviewed for that sort of thing. And a lot of that, I mean, because we have Activision as our publishing partners, we have the ability to lean on them for help with a lot of stuff like that. But yeah, we definitely do reviews because you can get into a lot of trouble with that sort of thing. And because we don't localize graphics, that is something we have to worry about because we can't change it for another language. And I'm sorry, the second question was?
About the web portal.
The web portal, yeah. So I don't know a lot of the details because, again, that's stuff that engineers implemented. What I'm told is it redirects based on the locale from your IP. So if you don't, I believe there's a cookie that gets set, and if you're a first-time user and you don't have anything, it tries to figure out where you are in the world based on either IP or browser settings or something like that to initialize it.
Cool.
But,
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Jidaiga Kawai from Japan, and just wondering, considering a lot of developers and publishers in the States are kind of ignorant about localization, and usually localization happens in the end of the production. And considering that, it seems like there was a huge leap from 2012 to 2015. And can you tell me what exactly happened to change that mindset?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at Bungie, a big piece of it was they went independent. So the last game that they had published, they were still a part of Microsoft. And being internal at Microsoft, they had Microsoft's localization team to work with. Localization had never really been something they needed to worry about internally. It was something where, towards the end of a project, someone who had another job would just be tasked with, okay, get the strings together to do a localization handoff, get those assets implemented back into the game. But there wasn't a need to have dedicated internal people. So it was a combination of that, I think, and also just building this new IP and wanting to do things right and build a global brand. They wanted to make sure that we were taking a good approach to localization.
Was it just for this game, or was it just as a Bungie company itself?
It's hard for me to say because I came on after they'd already decided to start building a localization team internally. So, yeah, half answer, but sorry.
All right, thanks.
Yep, thank you.
I'm sorry, I apologize, but it's now time to end this session. There is a wrap-up room in cell 300. You're welcome to ask additional questions there.
All right, thank you.